National Broadcasting Company and the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education, in cooperation with the American Political Science Association and the National Council for the Social Studies, present Continental Classroom, a course in the structure and functions of American government. Conducted by Dr. Peter H. Odegard, Professor of Political Science at the University of California at Berkeley. Professor Odegard.
This week, as we begin a discussion of the President and his relations to policy and administration, I'm changing the order somewhat of the topics as they appear in the written outline, and beginning today with a discussion of the President's relation to Congress. Some years ago, as a matter of fact, a good many years ago, 1898, Henry Jones Ford, in a classic volume called The Rise and Growth of American Politics, said, "The agency of the presidential office has been such a master force in shaping public policy that to give a detailed account of it would be equivalent to writing the political history of the United States." I cite this because you will remember that one of the things that James Madison warned strongly against was the encroachment of Congress upon the powers of the President, and also that Woodrow Wilson, in his congressional government, had said that it was Congress and not the President that was the dominant force in the government. And now you have Henry Jones Ford saying that to write the history of the presidency would be equivalent to writing the political history of the United States. Nevertheless, when all is said and done, it is to Congress that the President has to turn if the very great powers that are given to him in the Constitution are to be more than simply an empty facade. Throughout history, control of the purse has been an important factor in legislative control of the executive establishment. And through Congress's power to lay and collect taxes, to make appropriations for departments, and to legislate on all manner of important problems, it can, if it chooses to do so, reduce the powers of the President to a shadow. This being so, the relations between the President and the Congress become of central importance to the success of his administration and to the exercise of the presidential office and powers themselves. Although Section 1 says that all legislative powers shall be vested in Congress, it's important to remember that the President, too, is an active participant in the legislative process. Every act of Congress to have the force of law must bear the President's signature, and he can, as you know, veto acts of Congress and thus stop Congress, as it were, in its tracks, subject, of course, to the power of Congress to overcome this veto by a 2/3 vote. But beyond this, Section 3 of Article 2 requires the President, and I quote, "from time to time, to give to the Congress information of the state of the Union and recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient." In addition to this, of course, the President has his power to make treaties by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, and also executive orders on his own responsibility. And these international engagements entered into by the President have the force of law just as though they were enacted by both houses of the Congress. Now, these important legislative powers in the President and the important relations between the President and the Congress are theoretically carried on at arm's length. Unlike the Prime Minister and his cabinet in England, neither the President nor members of the executive establishment, excepting, of course, the Vice President, sit as members of the legislative branch, and except on the invitation of the Congress do they appear at all, except, of course, before committees, and even there, on invitation to the committee. The Vice President, as the presiding officer of the Senate, provides, it seems to me, a very weak link between the executive and the legislative establishment, because the Vice President takes no part in debate, and except in case of a tie, he has no vote. Now, this has disturbed a lot of people, this separation of powers. And numerous proposals have been made to provide a formal bridge between the White House and the Hill. The most radical, and I believe the most unrealistic of these proposals, would transform the American presidential system into a kind of imitation of the British parliamentary system. The President and his cabinet would be chosen by and from Congress, and there would be power in the President, in case of conflict, to dissolve Congress and rely on the next ensuing election to determine whether the President was to continue in office or to resign and make way for a new President chosen by the new Congress. May I suggest to you that you not hold your breaths waiting for this reform to be adopted. A much more modest proposal would give the members of the President's cabinet the right to sit in Congress without a vote, but would be available there to participate in debate and to answer questions when they were put to them on the floor. And still, a final proposal that in my judgment makes more sense is a proposal to increase the term of the House of Representatives from 2 years to 4 years, and to make the term correspond with the term of the President, so that the lower house, the House of Representatives, would come in and go out with the President, so that the President would not, therefore, be likely to confront a Congress right in the middle of his administration in the hands of the opposition party. Now, except for this proposal, and except also for those that would transform our presidential system into a parliamentary system, the other proposals all seem to me to be pretty fruitless and not to add very much to the working of our system. The President now communicates with Congress through his formal messages and through special messages from time to time. The executive heads now appear before committees, and this might be expanded to their more general appearance before the whole House or before the whole Senate or before large groups of congressmen, as is now done by the Secretary of State in his reviews of foreign policy for the Congress. Cabinet members can even now be invited to appear before the whole Congress if the Congress wants them to do so. And more formal arrangements might be made for the appearance of executive heads of departments before committees. But on the whole, it seems to me that it's very doubtful whether the heads of departments, compelled to spend all of their time or most of their time in Congress answering questions or taking part in debate, would be any better informed than they now are, or that Congress would be any better informed. And there's a grave risk in all this from the President's point of view, because the risk would be that you have a Secretary of State or a Secretary of the Treasury or what have you in the Congress. Some congressman asks him a question, he answers the question off the cuff. It might very well involve an important matter of policy that the President had not discussed. At any rate, it would involve giving to these men a degree of discretion that might very well prove embarrassing to the President. Now, the relations of the President and Congress are not as close as those between the Prime Minister and Parliament, as I've suggested. But neither, may I suggest, are they as remote or distant as the distance from the White House to the Capitol in Washington might seem to indicate. The formal messages of the President since Woodrow Wilson have been presented by the President in person, and these are supplemented by special messages on special measures. In this address by President Eisenhower, you see here this bit of film showing the President giving his message to the Congress. This is in 1958, January.
Mr. President, Mr. Speaker, members of the 85th Congress, my fellow citizens, honest men differ in their appraisal of America's material and intellectual strength and the dangers that today confront us. But all know that these dangers are real. The purpose of this message is to outline the measures that can give the American people a confidence just as real in their own security. I am not here to justify the past, gloss over the problems of the present, or propose any easy solutions for the future. I am here to state what I believe to be right, what I believe to be wrong, and to propose action for correcting what I think wrong.
The President's State of the Union message and other general addresses are likely to be in more or less general terms, but his special messages are much more likely to be specific and to carry with them actually draft bills drafted in the administration for formal introduction by friendly members into the Congress. As we've already noted, the President not only is a formal participant in the legislative process as provided in the Constitution, but he has in fact become the major source of legislation in our government, including the initiator of that most important of all pieces of legislation, the federal budget. As a matter of fact, so important has the President become as the legislative leader of the government that a distinguished authority a few years ago said, we elect the President as a leader of legislation. We hold him accountable for what he succeeds in getting Congress to do or in preventing Congress from doing. Once in office, the time and thought of the President and his cabinet are devoted far more largely to legislative than to executive matters, end quote. Nor is the President in his relations with Congress as isolated or remote as a doctrinaire theory of the separation of powers would cause one to believe. It's not only that the Constitution itself provides for a considerable commingling of legislative and executive powers. There are more informal, but more continuous, and perhaps, if more subtle, in many ways more effective, channels of communication and influence available to the President. And this is especially the case when his own party is in control of Congress. The Speaker of the House of Representatives, the Vice President, sometimes the President pro tem of the Senate, the Majority Leader in the Senate, the Majority Leader in the House, the party whips and their assistant whips, the chairman of important committees, particularly Committee on Appropriations, Ways and Means, Finance, the party caucus and conference, all of these taken together comprise a kind of a presidential legislative machine that under the leadership of a strong president of the same party can put the administration's legislative program through Congress with a minimum of revision or delay. In this picture, we have an unusual picture, as a matter of fact, of the legislative leaders of the Democratic Party during the 87th Congress, the first Congress of Mr. Kennedy's administration. Over here you see John McCormick, who was then the Majority Leader, to become Speaker on the death of Mr. Rayburn. Next to Mr. McCormick is Lyndon Johnson, the Vice President, presiding over the Senate, and a tower of strength for the administration in the Senate. Speaker Rayburn, the late Speaker Rayburn, who, as you know, was known as Mr. Democrat. Back of Mr. Rayburn, Senator Smathers, the chairman of the Senate Campaign Committee. And to Mr. Rayburn's left, Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota, the chief Democratic whip in the Senate. And next to him, Mike Mansfield, a senator from Montana, the majority leader in the Senate. This was the legislative machine of Mr. Kennedy and the Democratic Party in the 87th Congress. And of course, on the other side, there were the leaders of the minority party, the Republican Party, in Senator Dirksen, the Senate Minority Leader, and Representative Halleck, the Republican leader in the House. Now, conferences with these leaders of his own party, breakfasts, luncheons, dinners, both individually and in groups, enable the president to tell them what he wants, and incidentally, to put on whatever heat he can apply. Besides this, every major executive department gives high priority to its congressional relations, and most of them have one or more high officials who have major responsibility to maintain a continuous liaison with Congress. As far as the President is concerned, and working out of the executive office of the President, you will find a considerable staff, a dozen or more people, giving all of their time, or the major part of their time, to the maintenance and, if I may say so, the lubrication of this presidential congressional machine or apparatus. The special assistant to the President for congressional relations is a kind of impresario of this very complex and subtle operation. A wise president will seek for this position a man with political know-how and someone who can talk the language of a congressman or a senator. Mr. Kennedy's congressional relations assistant was described in 1961 by the Democratic Majority Leader, Senator Mansfield, as, and I quote, a practical politician with patience. He said, "We are in touch 4 or 5 times a week at least. And as far as the Senate is concerned, we have a good understanding and a good cooperation with the White House." The man who served President Eisenhower as Deputy Assistant for Congressional Affairs, when he left office, laid down a few simple rules for the guy who holds this job. He said he should make sure that the Presidential Assistant for Congressional Affairs speaks with the authority of the White House, and that what he says goes. Secondly, he should never mislead congressmen. Third, he should divorce any discussion of legislative matters from discussions of patronage, because they tend to get in each other's way. Mr. Harlow, Mr. Eisenhower's Deputy Assistant for Congressional Affairs, emphasized the importance and delicacy of the whole thing by saying that this office is an ambulatory bridge across a constitutional gulf. Now, nearly every president enjoys a honeymoon period in his relations with Congress during the first session following his election. This is especially true of a newly elected president who comes into office along with a clear majority of his own party in both House and Senate. By close cooperation with the big four that I mentioned before, the Vice President, the Speaker, the majority leaders, plus the chairman of important committees, a new president can very often have his way on most major matters of legislation. There's a kind of an afterglow of victory after such an election. New members are grateful to the president for his help in getting them elected in the previous November. And then the country, and Congress too, tend to be in a mood to expect the administration to translate at least some of its campaign promises into legislation. Promises which, incidentally, congressmen themselves are also identified with. And then there's always two, what I've called the big stick candy mountain of patronage. Thousands of jobs which the president has at his disposal, and for which nearly every congressman and a senator has a candidate or two. And the president can, with this big stick of patronage, almost literally buy legislation during his first term of office with his first session of Congress. As a matter of fact, in 1960, a volume of 141 pages was published containing the names of jobs available for presidential appointment, and I can assure you that this volume was eagerly read by members of Congress and the Senate. Now, when this presidential system of legislative influence and persuasion is working in high gear, a strong president can make an impressive record during his first term, and that's when most of them do make their records. Woodrow Wilson, someone has said, backed by a congressional majority, drove to the statute books legislation which in bulk and importance outranked any legislation enacted by any previous Congress within the same period. And he did this precisely in the way I've tried to describe, by a cooperation and discipline with the party leaders in the Congress. During the famous first 100 days of Franklin Roosevelt's first term, the basic structure of this machine was in high gear. Some insight into Mr. Roosevelt's methods are seen in this brief excerpt from the debate on the Economy Act in 1933. The majority leader is speaking to the Congress, and he says, when the congressional record goes to President Roosevelt's desk in the morning, he will look over the roll call we are about to take. And I warn you New Democrats to be pretty careful where your names are found. And this literally was done. The President actually intervened with congressmen on legislation. And how this system worked is illustrated by, some idea of it it can be illustrated by the amount of time that Congress devoted to important bills originating with the President. For example, the National Industrial Recovery Act took 6 hours to pass Congress, both houses. The Railroad Reorganization Act took 3 hours. An act for the relief of small homeowners took 1.5 hours. To put the Tennessee Valley Act through took 6 hours. The Securities Exchange Commission, 5 hours. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration, 2 hours. The Agricultural Relief Bill, 5.5 hours. And the Emergency Banking Bill, 40 minutes. The New Republic, which was friendly to the Roosevelt administration, even it was shocked by this and said the private individual member of Congress is dead. The key to the whole process has come into the President's hands. Now it would be romantic to assume that the President's congressional machine always or normally works with the smooth precision and power which these statements would seem to imply. At best, it works only with moderate efficiency, even when the President's own party has a large majority in both houses of Congress. It usually takes some external crisis, like a war or a depression or a long accumulation of abuses that cry out for reform to make the system function with the kind of efficiency that I've described. And after the honeymoon is over, after the jobs are filled, and particularly after the midterm election, the President is likely to confront a Congress much more independent, and the relations are likely to be much stickier. Even when his own party is in power, such are the internal conflicts within our party system that no president, Democratic or Republican, and however skillful he may be, can hope for solid support from representatives and senators even of his own party. Republican insurgents and progressives made life miserable for Republican presidents from McKinley to Hoover. and President Eisenhower found himself faced with an opposition party in Congress during most of his administration. For Democratic presidents, the situation is extraordinarily touchy, because many of the Democratic congressmen in most powerful positions are from the South, people who come from one-party districts, have a lot of seniority, and are consequently not as responsive to presidential influence and to presidential wiles as they might otherwise be. Moreover, they're not likely to share the views of a president elected largely by Northern Democratic votes. Senator Byrd, the chairman of the powerful Finance Committee in the Senate, probably is closer in his political attitudes to Republican Senator Dirksen of Illinois than he is to his Democratic colleagues Humphrey of Minnesota or Morse of Oregon. And so the president must seek in some way to operate with this refractious machine. And this is why President Kennedy in 1961 succeeded through a very complex maneuver in getting the House of Representatives to increase the size of the Rules Committee from 12 to 15 in order to bypass a hostile chairman, Howard Smith of Virginia, of that committee. It would be difficult to summarize the rules that should guide a president in his relations with Congress, but I would give one and emphasize it, that the president should never forget that he and he alone speaks for all the people, and that the presidency is the greatest sounding board and pulpit in the world for a man with faith in himself and with courage and capacity to make that faith known to Congress.
This has been a pre-recorded NBC educational production.